Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going back in time to 1775, the world of Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. We're not going to cover the whole book, of course, but we're going to take a look at some excerpts, some key parts that really capture the heart of it.
Think of this deep dive as, I guess, your cheat sheet to understanding this masterpiece without having to read every single page.
Right, exactly. We'll be looking at his descriptions of London and Paris, getting to know the main players like Dr. Manette and, of course, the unforgettable Madame Defarge. And we'll even touch on the French Revolution itself.
And this deep dive isn't just going to be about historical drama. We'll be looking at the themes that make Dickens so relevant, even, all these years later. Resurrection, duality, sacrifice, these elements of the human condition that we're all still dealing with.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Dickens just throws us right into the contrasting worlds of London and Paris in 1775. Both monarchies, but change is simmering under the surface. What's really interesting is how Dickens sets up this contrast right away.
Yeah. He describes this feeling in England that things are settled forever, even if it's not really true. But in France, you have the extravagance of the aristocracy right up against the poverty of the common people. Dickens really sets up this powder keg perfectly.
And then we come to the wine shop in Paris, which Dickens describes in such detail. It almost becomes a character itself. It's a microcosm of, like, the revolutionary sentiment brewing just below the surface.
Oh, absolutely. He uses these really vivid sensory details. Spilled wine staining the cobblestones red, the smell of, poverty and desperation in the air. There's even a joker who writes the word blood on a wall, which is just chilling foreshadowing.
Yeah, he really had a knack for creating this feeling of unrest. So now let's meet some of the people living in these two different worlds. We've got Charles Darnay, a French aristocrat who's actually renounced his title and family name to build a new life in England.
But his past and his connection to the French Revolution is going to catch up with him. That internal conflict is a huge part of the story.
Then there's Dr. Manette, a brilliant physician who was imprisoned in the Bastille for 18 years for no good reason. Dickens really shows us the psychological trauma, a man trying to put his life back together.
And what's really interesting here is that Dr. Manette's story really embodies this theme of resurrection. His release from prison and his journey to reclaim his life, it represents this possibility of healing and hope, even after suffering.
His reunion with his daughter, Lucie, becomes this really moving symbol of that hope.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of Lucie Manette, she's described as this beacon of compassion and love, resilience in the face of hardship.
Yeah, she's the counterpoint to all the darkness around her.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have Sydney Carton. Now, he's a complicated guy, a brilliant but cynical lawyer, almost self-destructive, really.
Yeah, he seems stuck in this cycle of despair, but there's something else there too, right?
Exactly. He's in love with Lucie, secretly, which means he's capable of deep feeling. There's this sense that he could find redemption, and that potential becomes a key part of his story. And then, well, we have to talk about Madame Defarge.
She's a force of nature, isn't she? The embodiment of revolutionary rage. What's striking is that image of her always knitting.
Right. Dickens uses this everyday thing to represent something much darker. She's not knitting scarves. She's creating a register of those who are going to be sent to the guillotine, a list fueled by years of oppression and revenge.
Her husband, Monsieur Defarge, the owner of the wine shop, is also a major part of the revolution. They're storm clouds gathering over Paris. So what is it that actually sets this powder keg off? What's the central conflict?
It all revolves around Charles Darnay trying to escape his aristocratic past as the French Revolution begins. He's falsely accused of treason in England, which shows us the political tensions of that time. And this is where Sydney Carton, surprisingly, steps in.
Right, he uses his striking resemblance to Darnay to save him. It's almost like foreshadowing of sacrifices to come.
Exactly. But the tension just keeps building as the revolution in France explodes into chaos. We see the storming of the Bastille, and then the reign of terror begins, brutal and often indiscriminate violence.
Dickens captures this mob mentality so well. There's that chilling scene where a peasant who wants revenge for his child's death murders the Marquis. It's like a spark that ignites this wave of violence.
It's a reminder that violence begets violence, and the lines between justice and revenge can get blurry, especially in times like that. And the Defarges are in the middle of it all, fueling the revolution for their own goals. Madame Defarge especially seems driven by her vendetta against Darnay's family.
So we have these compelling characters, this historical backdrop, but Dickens doesn't stop there, right? He uses symbolism and themes that take the story beyond just a historical drama.
Exactly. Take resurrection, for example, which is not just in Dr. Manette's story, but also in Paris itself as it goes through this violent change. And then you have duality. London and Paris, the two Darnays, Carton and Stryver. It's this idea of contrasting forces throughout the story.
It's like he's showing us human nature, how even in the darkest times, there's potential for incredible good and incredible evil. Which brings us to the lawyer, Stryver.
He's almost the opposite of Sydney Carton, wouldn't you say? Driven, ambitious, and totally lacking Carton's introspection.
He seems obsessed with outward success, with climbing the social ladder, but he relies on Carton's brilliance to win his cases.
It's like Dickens is saying that true brilliance is often overlooked, while those who are louder and more self-promoting get the attention.
And Stryver's completely oblivious to Carton's feelings for Lucie, which just makes the story even more tragic.
Right. There's that sad scene where Stryver tells Mr. Lorry about wanting to marry Lucie like it's a done deal. He can't even imagine that she might not feel the same way.
Dickens really highlights the difference between these two men. Stryver, blind to matters of the heart, and Carton, sensitive but hiding behind his cynicism. What about Miss Pross? Lucie Manette's loyal companion, her protector. What's her role in all of this?
Miss Pross is a force of nature, fiercely loyal to Lucie. She brings some humor to the story, which is a nice change.
She's like a mother hen protecting her chick. She sees right through Stryver and is fiercely protective of Lucie.
Her character reminds us that love comes in many forms. Sometimes the most unexpected people become our greatest allies.
And Dickens doesn't just tell us about their bond, he shows us. There's that scene where he describes Miss Pross taking care of Lucie so tenderly, brushing her hair, folding her clothes, while grumbling about the men who want to marry her. It really emphasizes their connection.
It's a nice contrast to the more tragic love stories in the novel.
Now, before we get to the main part of the story, we need to touch on the historical context. The French Revolution isn't just a backdrop for Dickens, it's a turning point in history.
It's important to remember that Dickens isn't writing a history textbook. He's using this historical event to explore human nature, what pushes people to extremes, and the terrible consequences of inequality.
He doesn't shy away from showing how brutal the revolution was, the mob mentality, the reign of terror.
But he also shows moments of humanity amidst the chaos. People like Dr. Manette and Lucie who fight for what's right, even when they're suffering. Dickens reminds us that even in the darkest times, kindness can survive.
And that individuals can make a difference.
Exactly. And it's that tension between hope and despair that drives the story, pulling us into the lives of these characters who are caught in the middle of it all. It's amazing how Dickens can make you care so much about these characters, even when you know what's going to happen. It's like watching a car crash in slow motion. You can't look away.
And he's so good at building suspense, like with that foreshadowing. Remember those early descriptions of the wine shop, the spilled wine on the cobblestones? Subtle, but powerful.
Oh, and Madame Defarge always knitting. It's like a reminder that she's, keeping track of who's going to die. Every stitch is like weaving the revolution. It's scary.
Dickens takes these everyday things, knitting, drinking wine, and turns them into symbols. It's really clever. He connects the characters' lives to this huge historical drama, which makes the revolution feel real, personal.
And he doesn't shy away from showing the mental toll it takes. Dr. Manette, even after he's free, still has those moments of trauma.
Like when he goes back to making shoes, even after he's with Lucie again. It's so sad, but it shows that the past can really stick with you.
It speaks to the power of trauma, how complicated healing can be, and it also shows how much Lucie loves her father. She never gives up on him.
Her devotion is amazing. She's like an anchor in a storm, giving strength and stability to her father and her husband.
Fate plays a big part in this story too, Dickens seems to be saying that even though we make choices, there are bigger forces that shape our lives.
That age-old question, how much control do we actually have? How do you deal with things when they're out of your control?
It's a relevant question, especially in uncertain times. And Dickens doesn't give us easy answers. He gives us these characters, flawed and complicated, and lets us decide for ourselves.
Which brings us to one of the most famous lines. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It perfectly captures the French Revolution, a time of hope and incredible suffering.
And that duality is reflected in the characters, too. For some, like the Defarges, the revolution is a chance for revenge. For others, like Darnay and Dr. Manette, it's dangerous.
It's like Dickens is saying that every revolution, every big change has a price. Winners and losers, heroes and villains, and sometimes it's hard to tell who's who. Speaking of blurred lines, what about redemption? It seems to run through the whole story, especially with Sydney Carton's sacrifice.
That's where you really see how complex Carton is. He goes from being this bitter, wasted guy to someone who's willing to die for the woman he loves, even though he can't be with her.
It's the ultimate act of love, right? Choosing to sacrifice your own happiness for someone else. And it makes his last words even more powerful. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. Sacrificing yourself, being selfless, and finding a kind of victory, even in death. So moving.
Oh.
So does this mean a happy ending for Darnay and Lucie?
Well, Carton's sacrifice lets Darnay go back to Lucie and their family. But the revolution doesn't just end. It goes on, and a lot of people die. It leaves scars that last for generations.
What about Madame Defarge? She's been so focused on revenge. Does she get what she wants?
She's so consumed by it that she's killed by Miss Pross. It's a dramatic ending that really fits her character, someone who represents how destructive revenge can be.
Her death also shows how violence can go in circles. The revolution was necessary to get rid of tyranny, but it also unleashed forces that were impossible to control. So much destruction and trauma.
Dickens leaves us with this feeling of, uncertainty. The danger to the main characters is over, but the fight for justice and equality isn't. The revolution left deep wounds.
It makes you think about how history isn't a simple story with a clear ending. It's a process, a constant struggle to make things better.
And that's one of the things that makes A Tale of Two Cities so powerful. It makes us look at our own time and see the potential for good and evil in ourselves. And it encourages us to work for a world that's more just and compassionate.
We've talked about so much in this deep dive, from those fancy palaces to the reality of the streets, from the revolution's horrors to the small moments that show the character's humanity. I feel like we've really gotten to the core of A Tale of Two Cities.
What stands out to you most? What will you take away from our exploration of Dickens?
For me, it's the message of hope, even when things are really bad. Characters like Dr. Manette and Sydney Carton went through so much pain, but they found a way to rebuild their lives and do good in the world. It's a powerful message, and it's still important today.
I agree. Dickens could blend history, social commentary, and these timeless themes into a story that's both entertaining and makes you think. He makes us look deeper and think about good and evil, justice and revenge, and how strong the human spirit can be.
So to everyone listening, if you've enjoyed this deep dive into A Tale of Two Cities, I really recommend reading the whole book. Dickens' writing will stay with you, and you'll discover something new each time you read it.
As you go deeper into the story, think about this. How do the events of the French Revolution connect to our world today? What are the similarities between the struggles in Dickens' time and what we're facing now? It's something to think about. You might be surprised at how relevant Dickens still is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into A Tale of Two Cities. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those minds working.
So we're at the climax of the story now. Things are really coming to a head. Charles Darnay, even with Dr. Manette trying to save him, is sentenced to death.
Oh man, it's a crushing blow for Darnay, for Lucie, for her father. They've been through so much already, you really feel like there's no hope. But of course, Sydney Carton is still out there, kind of in the background. Do you think, is there any chance he can pull something off to save Darnay?
Well, Dickens has been hinting at this all along, right? About how much Carton looks like Darnay. And now, all those hints, they all pay off with this crazy, daring plan that Carton comes up with.
Yeah, so Carton uses his smarts, his connections, and that resemblance to break Darnay out of prison. He switches places with him.
It's just, wow, such a selfless act. It changes everything we thought we knew about Sydney Carton.
Yeah.
The cynical guy, the one who seemed to be destroying himself. In this moment, he becomes something else. He finds a purpose that's bigger than himself.
He's not just saving Darnay, he's saving himself in a way. Carton finally finds a way to, to make his life mean something, to make up for his past. Does Dickens give us any clues about how Carton's feeling during all of this?
He really captures those final moments. There's this quiet dignity and a kind of peace that Carton never had before.
And his last words, before he goes to the guillotine, they're so famous. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. Giving up everything, thinking of others, and somehow finding triumph, even in death. It's really powerful. So, does this mean a happy ending for Darnay and Lucie?
I mean, Carton's sacrifice does allow Darnay to get back to Lucie and their family, but it's not like the revolution just ends. It keeps going, and so many people die. The damage lasts for a long time.
Right. Right. What about Madame Defarge? She's been so driven by revenge. Does she get what she wants?
No. She's so consumed by it that she ends up being killed by Miss Pross. It's a very dramatic scene, and it fits her character, someone who represents how destructive revenge can be.
And it shows how violence can just keep repeating. The revolution was important, but it also set loose things that were impossible to control. So much destruction.
Yeah. Dickens leaves us with a sense of, is it really over? The immediate danger is gone, but the fight for justice, for equality, that's not finished. And those scars from the revolution are still there.
It's like he's saying that history isn't a simple story with a beginning and an end. It's always going on. It's this constant struggle to make the world a better place.
And that's what makes A Tale of Two Cities so powerful. It makes us look at our own world and see the potential for good and bad inside all of us. It makes us want to work for a world that's fairer, more compassionate.
We've gone through a lot in this deep dive. The fancy parts of the city and the rough parts, the violence and the little moments that show us who these characters really are. We really got to the heart of A Tale of Two Cities, didn't we?
We did. It's been quite a journey.
So to everyone listening, if you've been interested in this deep dive, I really encourage you to read A Tale of Two Cities yourself. Dickens' writing will stay with you, and every time you read it, you'll find something new.
And as you go deeper into the story, think about this. How does the French Revolution connect to the world today? What's similar between what people were going through then and what we're dealing with now? It's a question worth thinking about. You might be surprised at how much Dickens still has to say to us.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into A Tale of Two Cities. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep thinking.